Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mad in America. This is your host for today, Ayurveda Dhar, founder and editor of Mad in South Asia. Our guest today is Dr. Hal Elliott. Dr. Elliott is a professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Minnesota. He has received numerous awards, grants, and fellowships for his work in bioethics. His writings have appeared in The Atlantic, The New York Times, among other places, and his most recent book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice, Medical Experimentation, and The Price of Saying No, just came out. Dr. Elliott was first trained in medicine and then ventured into philosophy for reasons we will soon discuss. But in today's interview, we will talk to him about his own experience with whistleblowing, corruption in medicine, especially psychiatry, and discuss some of the most egregious examples of wrongdoing in research. Dr. Elliott, welcome to Mad in America.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's dig in. The first is, let's go over your new book, The Occasional Human Sacrifice. Can you begin with your story and the details of your case and your experience with whistleblowing?
That story begins, I guess, for me in the summer of 2008, which is when I was on sabbatical, first in New Zealand, but later in South Africa. And I got an email message from a friend of mine, a reporter in the Twin Cities, Paul Tosto, who wanted to know what I made of a series about a death in a clinical trial that he and his colleague, Jeremy Olson, had written for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, which is the St. Paul city newspaper. And I read it, and it hit very hard. It was a horrible story. The short version of it is that a young man named Dan Markingson was brought to our teaching hospital in the throes of a psychotic episode. He was delusional. He was violent. He was threatening to commit mass murder. He was threatening to kill his mother, who he was living with at the time. And he was seen by the head of the schizophrenia program at the University of Minnesota, judged to be incompetent to consent to take neuroleptic drugs, and involuntarily committed to a locked unit in our hospital. Eventually, after being seen by a number of clinicians, consultants, the judgment that he was not competent to consent and that he was psychotic and dangerous to himself or others was confirmed many times, and he was placed under a civil commitment order. But in Minnesota, there's something called a stay of commitment, which means that you can avoid a locked unit if you agree to abide by the treatment recommendations of your psychiatrist. So that was what his psychiatrist recommended, that he be given a stay of commitment, as long as he did what he said, right? Ordinarily, he would have been given standard treatment under these circumstances, but instead, he was asked to sign up for a clinical trial of a comparative trial of 3 antipsychotic drugs. It was sponsored by the drug company AstraZeneca. And he signed the consent form. When his mother found out about that, she was alarmed and upset. She didn't want him in a clinical trial. He was violent. He was threatening to kill her. He was in a locked unit. He was under a commitment order. And he had been judged incompetent to consent to take neuroleptic drugs. And this was a trial of neuroleptic drugs. She was told, look, it's his decision, not yours. He's an adult. He's staying in the trial. She then spent the next 4 months, I believe, trying to get him out of the trial, trying desperately. She could see him deteriorating, see his thinking become more grandiose. He stopped showering. He became incredibly agitated. She thought he was, she said it was like he was about to explode any minute. All the while, she's trying desperately to get him out of the trial. She's sending emails. She's calling the study coordinator, calling the Department of Psychiatry, writing letters. Can't get any response at all, any satisfactory response anyway. Eventually, she leaves a voicemail, kind of a desperate voicemail for the study coordinator saying, what is it going to take for anybody to do anything about this? Does he have to kill somebody or kill himself? And 3 weeks later, that's what he did. He took a box cutter and slit his own throat, almost decapitating himself, mutilated his body, which was found in a halfway house in the shower, along with a note that said, I went through this experience smiling. That was essentially the story as it was laid out in the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Part of the reason it hit hard for me is that these were the kinds of things that I work on, and they were happening at my institution. I had been on the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, for a couple of years. I hadn't reviewed that study, but I had reviewed studies like that. I worked on psychiatric ethics. I had friends in the Department of Psychiatry, and I felt, a sense of responsibility, shame, something. It felt as if this was not an ordinary case of research abuse. It was one that took place at my own institution. Essentially, I got back to Minnesota, started asking around. Nobody seemed particularly upset or interested in this. My worry, besides what had happened to Dan Markingson, which was horrible, I was worried that he was not the only one. If they were recruiting this subject from a locked ward, how was I to know that they were not recruiting other subjects like that from a locked ward under commitment orders?
When you kind of pushed for more information, or, what was the response of the institution and colleagues and other people?
Well, depending on who I talked to, or a response that was more or less, wow, that looks bad, but what can you do? To just outright dismissal from administrators at the university. I was essentially told, look, you don't know what happened in this study. You can't believe what's written in the newspapers. They obviously had it in for the university. And if you actually believe that story as it's written, then you're just incredibly naive. Plus, this kind of stuff happens all the time. As part of the business of doing clinical trials is sometimes people die. He was obviously really mentally ill, so it's unfair to blame the psychiatrist or the university or anybody else. There's another thing about it that, that was suggested to me more than once, which was that Dan Markington's mother, Mary Weiss, was somehow responsible for his death. And this seemed, I don't know, it seemed like something that was inappropriate or out of bounds for a conversation between someone like me and an administrator. And it seemed like an effort to smear her. So I decided maybe I needed to talk to her because she was being portrayed as someone who was vindictive and irrational, and who had a troubled relationship and with her son and was trying to blame the university for what had happened. And so I went and met with her. She was not eager to see me, obviously. By this point, this was 4 years after Dan Markingson's suicide. She didn't really want to have anything to do with people at the University of Minnesota. But the reporter, Paul Tosto, managed to convince her to meet with me, that I was different from other people at the U. And she did. And, her response was completely different from that of the administrators and psychiatrists that I talked to. Her response was, look, you don't have to believe me. See for yourself. She had filed a lawsuit against the University of Minnesota after the death, but it had been dismissed by a judge on the grounds of statutory immunity, that as a state institution, the University of Minnesota, as an institution, the IRB could not be sued, that it was immune from lawsuit, regardless of the merits of the case. And then the university had turned around and filed a notice to assess costs against her, demanding that she pay the University of Minnesota $56,000 to cover its court costs and the costs of hiring expert witnesses. She had, on the advice of her lawyers, agreed to drop her right to appeal the immunity ruling in exchange for the university agreeing to drop that demand for $56,000. But she hadn't signed a confidentiality agreement. So
Right.
she just said, look, you can look at the records, the hospital records, you can look at the depositions, you can look at anything you want to look at from that litigation. I'll ask my lawyer to make everything available to you, and you can just decide for yourself on the merits of the case. And that's what I did. And she was right. And the university was wrong. I mean, they were being deceptive and misleading.
So that is something that I want to talk about, actually. The force with which the institution comes down upon someone, right? So I noticed this pattern, which is that a person reports a wrongdoing, and then the muscle of the institution bears down on them with such force. It took me aback a little bit. The dismissal, or the way I've seen people's character, assassinated, and often people are ostracized and isolated. And a very common response is, the whistleblower went, how could I have been so naive to expect anything else to come out of this? I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this disillusionment, this shattering of a person's faith, and maybe, give an example from your book about a case.
In general, whistleblowers have a certain measure of idealism to them, or at least optimism, because it takes that in order to blow the whistle. If you're totally cynical about the system, you won't blow the whistle, because your expectation will be, it'll do no good and it'll all just blow back on me. So to be a whistleblower, in general, you have to have some sort of faith that there's a possibility that when other people know what you know, that they'll be just as outraged as you are. And your hope is that that outrage will extend to your friends, and that they'll stand by you, and colleagues who'll stand by you, and that someone with power, a regulatory authority, the courts, someone will leap into action and fix the problem. And when they blow the whistle, that doesn't happen. It almost never happens, actually. The authorities don't leap into action. Nobody is as outraged as they are. And often their friends dry up, leave. And their colleagues generally stand with the institution. And all of this comes as a kind of existential blow. I mean, it's a kind of collapse of your values and your worldview. It's very difficult to hang on to the sense that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice when you go through this kind of experience. The other thing that I think is going on, and this is particularly true, I think, for the physicians, is that they essentially lose their professional community and they lose their identity because they're expelled. They're seen as a traitor, Judas Iscariot. They are cast out, sent away, and they have to find a new way to think about themselves, a new sort of identity in the absence of that kind of professional community. And so there's a process of, trying to rebuild who you thought you were, both socially and in terms of your values. Part of that, comes from my own experience with the Dan Markington case, because in the end, I mean, it took a lot of allies working at the university, a lot of desperate, futile attempts to get some sort of action. In 2010, I wrote about the case for Mother Jones magazine, hoping that some sort of national attention and some new information about the sponsor of the study would prompt the kind of outrage that would shame the university into taking some sort of action and commissioning an external investigation of the case. And that really didn't happen. About the only thing that happened as a result of that was to make myself extremely unpopular in the academic health center at the university, and lost a lot of friends over that, and a lot of colleagues. But over a period of the next 5 years, we eventually managed, with the help, I should say, of a former governor of Minnesota, Arne Carlson, who was just fantastic. We eventually got 2 external reviews of the university, the most important of which was by a watchdog agency, the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And it confirmed all of the things that you would expect, from reading what I'd written, and in fact, from reading what had been written in the St. Paul Pioneer Press in 2008. That came out in 2015. And combined with another review, which found real problems with our research oversight system at the university, it seemed as if we were kind of making progress, or at least, it seemed like a vindication in a way. And, when you're going through this, a vindication is at least part of what you're hoping for, but it's not all, because you want something to be done. And that's where it felt like a failure, because the university did not compensate Mary Weiss. It didn't apologize publicly. It didn't sanction the researchers. It did agree to suspend psychiatric drug studies at the university for a period. What bureaucracies usually do in response to a scandal is, a self-study reform group, largely made up of people who could be counted on to back the university, which really accomplished very little. And so after about a year or so, it seemed as if, we'd spent all this time really working for nothing.
I was just wondering, if it's so bad for people with power, if so little is often managed despite overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, what chance do survivors or just service users or patients, right, have if it's so easy to just decimate professionals? So, like patients who speak against involuntary treatment and electroconvulsive treatment and other abuses and things like that. Do you have any ideas?
I can tell you the demoralizing part, and I can tell you like a very slight ray of hope. So the demoralizing part, in part to find out the answer to these questions, I started teaching a class on research scandals. And the idea behind the class is, if we could just study these scandals side by side, we could pick out the patterns. How do they usually turn out? Are there usually whistleblowers? How are they exposed? What do universities do? What are the common patterns that lead to abuses and so on? And, it's an incredibly depressing course. It's all scandals, 2 scandals a week for a semester. So usually about 25, 26. Psychiatry is overrepresented in the way specialties are divided up, which I think probably should not be surprising to anyone. And the demoralizing part is that research institutions never do the right thing when a scandal emerges. I have yet to come across a single case in which a research institution has done the right thing. They stonewall the press. They vilify the whistleblowers, if there are whistleblowers. They steadfastly refuse to apologize. Not only do they not sanction the researchers, very often they honor them with awards and prizes. And they fight as hard as possible to compensate the victims. This is the pattern that you see again and again. Overwhelmingly, the subjects of the abuse, the research subjects who've been mistreated or deceived, are vulnerable in some way. They're mentally ill, they're mentally disabled, they're children, they're institutionalized, they're in prisons, they're poor, they're uneducated. In some way, they're vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. And one of the most striking findings is that whistleblowers in these cases are very rare. I picked out 6 cases, 7 if you include, my own experience for the book. But, there are way more scandals out there. And in many of them, doctors, nurses, study personnel, administrators, attorneys know about these cases for years, sometimes even for decades, and have said nothing. It's only in the rare cases that someone actually speaks out. And even if they speak out, it's rare that they succeed. That said, that's the demoralizing part. The slight ray of hope is that when there is some sort of solidarity, there is a much higher chance of success. And by that, I mean solidarity among the whistleblowers. If there are several whistleblowers, they're much more likely to come out of the experience psychologically intact and with results, concrete results, more likely than a sole whistleblower acting alone. And the other thing is, if you look at the cases that did the scandals that led to some reform, maybe it's not that much and maybe it's unsatisfactory, but something was done. Usually it's because it has dovetailed with a larger social movement. So, for example, the famous case in America, the Tuskegee syphilis study, when that was exposed in 1972, all the subjects who were deceived, exploited, abused in that case were poor Black men, and it dovetailed with the civil rights movement of the 60s and 70s. In New Zealand, their unfortunate experiment, which was done on women with a precursor of cervical cancer, it dovetailed with the women's movement. And to the extent that the abuses at the Willowbrook State School, which included infecting institutionalized mentally disabled children with the hepatitis A and B viruses, to the extent that that had a larger social effect, it's because it dovetailed with the disability rights movement. And this is, I think, is the challenge for those of us who work on psychiatric research abuses, is there hasn't been a case that has dovetailed with a larger social movement in a way that has produced any kind of larger change.
You said something here. You said doctors and nurses and researchers, they say nothing for years, right? And then I'm thinking, in comes a whistleblower and this person says something. And I remember in one of the articles, you said the problem isn't just that people are not brave enough. The problem is often moral perception, I think is what you called it. Like, most people don't even see this as abuse or a wrongdoing or something awful anymore. And you talk about medical training and what medical training does to a person, not being able to see abuse and exploitation, how a person is trained into it. But I want you to talk a little bit about this. What does medical training, this type of indoctrination, look like?
What you have to understand about medical training is that when you begin it, you know nothing, right? Someone who knows nothing, who is allowed to be around patients who are sick and vulnerable, can be very dangerous. So by necessity, medical training is a kind of apprenticeship where you go from knowing nothing to being taught by being around and learning from people who know more than you do how things are done. And, it can be very scary to be on the wards and be afraid that you're going to harm someone or even kill them by being given too much responsibility and having so little knowledge. So traditionally, and I think by necessity, medical training is very hierarchical. It's perhaps not necessarily very authoritarian, but it is, right? And as a young medical student on the wards, you encounter things that you've never seen before in your life, and you have very little knowledge or experience in how to deal with them. I mean, it starts with, the anatomy lab and the cadaver, but, there's just so many, particularly when you start dealing with living patients, people who may be brain dead or vegetative, or who are desperately sick and dying of cancer, or, who are floridly psychotic on a locked unit on the psychiatry service. And most people in unfamiliar situations just sort of look around and do what other people are doing, right? It's kind of like being in a foreign country where you don't know anything about the manners or the culture or the history. You don't want to cause anybody offense. You don't want to, do anything wrong. So you just kind of do what everybody else is doing. And that makes it very easy to put aside your initial intuition about these unfamiliar situations, which is something's wrong here. This is not right, in favor of, well, I mean, this is the way it's done. This is the way it's always been done. These people know a lot more than I do. I guess this is the way it has to be done. The case in the book that really struck me, and it was one of the issues that I really wanted to dig into with the whistleblowers there, is the case of the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island. And this was a unbelievably squalid, filthy, overcrowded institution for mentally disabled children, the largest such institution in the United States. And a young internist named Mike Wilkins and a colleague of his, Bill Bronston, began working there in the early 1970s. Not because they were interested in any kind of long-term jobs there. It was because they were with the U.S. Public Health Service. It was Vietnam era. They were in the Public Health Service as a way to avoid being sent to Vietnam. And, so they were very socially conscious, left-leaning activist types. Now, there is a film of conditions at the Willowbrook State School that emerged when Mike Wilkins blew the whistle after being fired to a reporter. And you can see it online. It's called Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace. And that footage of that institution is unbelievable, wrenching. I cried when I saw it for the first time. I could not believe that this institution that I had read about, in bioethics textbooks for years, was actually like this. This is not what I had ever imagined. I mean, just the worst concentration camp-like conditions. Children with no clothes on, obviously mentally disabled, lying in their own urine on concrete floors. I mean, just, hours and hours and days of nothing to do, no one watching them. I mean, it was just hellish. And what was interesting to me and remarkable to me is that it took these two outsiders to come in and look at this place and say, my God, this is a crime scene, when hundreds of other people had been working there for decades and saw nothing wrong with it. I mean, I cannot imagine how anyone can see children in those conditions and say, this is the way it has to be. There's nothing we can do to fix it. And yet that was their response. I mean, when Mike Wilkins and Bill Bronston went in, their aim was, let's organize all the doctors, to clean this place up. Doctors had no interest in that. They tried the nurses. No, nurses had no interest in that. They tried the staff, the maintenance staff, anybody. And it was only when they went to parents and started sneaking parents back onto the wards to see what they had never been allowed to see before that they were able to generate some kind of, pushback against the institution. So my question, was twofold. One, how is it possible for anybody to work in that place for so long and resist any sort of reform or not see it as worthy of reform or, in need of reform? And two, what was it about these two people who saw things differently? What was it about them that allowed them to see the conditions there for what they were?
When I looked at these two books, there seems to be a systemic problem. So, for example, I saw whistleblowers. Every time somebody reported wrongdoing, the whole might of the institution comes upon them, right? But when people are caught red-handed, when researchers were caught red-handed, abusing their power in the worst ways possible, but one of the worst cases you talked about was Farouk Abu Zahab. And Abu Zahab was on the Surcare watch list. He had his license suspended. He was a psychiatrist. And then in 2003, he received the American Psychiatric Association's Distinguished Life Fellowship Award, right? So the whistleblower sees the might of the institution. The wrongdoer sees every possible protection and even honors and awards, despite the fact that this person is on a watch list and had his license suspended.
I first met Dr. Abu Zahab shortly after I arrived at the University of Minnesota. This would have been in the late 90s, I believe. He sort of introduced himself as a clinician in private practice, but he said, I was on the faculty at the University of Minnesota for many years, and I'm still a clinical faculty member. And I have a lot of experience in ethics. I was chair of the ethics committee for the State Psychiatric Association. There was some trouble in a research study that I was doing, and I've been told that I have to take a class in ethics, and I see that you're teaching one, and would it be okay if I sat in? I was very naive back then, and I would never say yes to a request like that now. But this was a long time ago, and I was new to the university, and I kind of wanted to be a team player, as they say. So I said sure, and he was fine. He came. He seemed interested. Actually, he took part. But then a few years later, I started getting interested again in phase 1 clinical trials, these safety trials that recruit and pay healthy subjects to test new drugs. And I had seen that there was a new clinical trial site in the Twin Cities. And I went on their website and I was looking over their list of investigators. And I saw Abu Zahab's name there. And I thought, that's that guy who was in my class. I wonder what it was that got him into trouble. So I dug him up. I got a copy of his, the disciplinary action from the licensing board. And it wasn't a clinical trial. There were 46 deaths and injuries in clinical trial and, in patients under his care, many of them in clinical trials, some of them in clinical trials at our own teaching hospital, including a number of suicides. And the licensing board has suspended his license for a short period of time, made him practice under the supervision of someone else, and ordered him to take an ethics course, which I taught sort of unknowingly. I was just sort of stunned by this. I mean, why would a trial site hire somebody like this with this kind of record to do trials for them? I mean, all you have to do is Google his name at this point, and all of these red flags come up. I mean, it was in the newspapers. He was on, I think, Dateline. NBC did an investigation into him. I mean, it wasn't as if this was a secret. Bob Whitaker had written about him in the Boston Globe. And yet, 46 deaths and injuries did not seem to bother this trial site at all. Well, it turned out when I began to look into it that they just had done no background research into him at all. All they knew was that he was very well connected to the pharmaceutical industry, was, on their speakers bureau for a lot of different companies, had experience doing a lot of clinical trials. And I guess they saw him as a rainmaker, a money generator because of his contacts with pharma. Again, the subjects in those trials were very vulnerable subjects, often with schizophrenia, often with substance abuse issues. And he was basically just cycling them in and out of studies, often studies that they weren't even eligible for, as a as a way of generating revenue, more or less. So I wound up writing about him in a New Yorker piece, which was then adapted into the chapter in White Coat, Black Hat that you read.
I was thinking of two things here. One, how has this changed in the age of social media, right? You have influencers now who talk about having a diagnosis. And influencers are not regulated. They can tell people to go take a drug for some off-label use, right? One is I was wondering how this has changed in how pharma and social media have kind of worked with each other. And the other thing was I noticed a pattern that everybody, from doctors to researchers, everybody maintained that taking money or having ties with the industry did not corrupt them. Absolutely did not, right? It was ridiculous to assume that a few pens and knickknacks would corrupt my prescribing patterns or something like that. And at the same time, I think you have noted, and there has been enough evidence and research showing that these things do have an influence on people's prescribing patterns. Industry-sponsored trials produce better results for the industry for a drug. Consistently, research has shown this. So I was seeing a very interesting contradiction, which is that, doctors and scientists and we guys are like, oh, I believe in evidence. And the evidence is saying this has an influence on your behavior, but it just does not this time. It's like, I believe in evidence, but not evidence that's against me. So
right.
Just some thoughts about that.
This is the pattern that we've seen for decades now, and I can't see a whole lot of change. At least not a lot of change for the better. Some changes for the worse. And part of the reason for conflict of interest rules is deal with exactly the problem that you identify, which is, yes, in the aggregate, there's ample data showing that prescribing is influenced in a huge way by ties with industry, by gifts, by being on speakers bureaus, by doing studies for industry and so on. But there is no way to determine for a single person what's going on in their head. This is why we have conflict of interest rules. We know that conflicts of interest do affect decisions. So we devise conflict of interest rules in order to manage those in some way, preferably by preventing the conflict in action. So, for example, judges, if they have a financial interest in the result of a court case, they're supposed to recuse themselves. If a journalist has a financial interest in something that they're covering, they're not allowed to cover it. All right. But in medicine, the way that these conflicts are allegedly managed is just by disclosing them. In other words, you can keep taking the money as long as you don't hide the fact that you're taking the money. To me, that's like saying bribery's fine as long as it's not secret bribery. Of course, it's still a conflict. And, the fact that it's in the open really helps the situation very little.
Often in negative ways. I mean, some research shows disclosing conflict of interest makes you do worse.
More bias. Yeah, you're exactly right. And again, this is part of the big push. The 1990s were like the worst era for pharma influence. The blockbuster drug era was unlike anything before or since. And part of the pushback towards this enormous influence that the drug industry was exerting on physicians by gifts, speaking engagements, parties, conference sponsorships, and so on, was to push for what we now have, which is the open payments database, where you can go and look up any physician and find out how much money they have been getting from the pharmaceutical industry. We have that, and we can look them up, but it hasn't made the situation better in any way. It's as if people just feel, well, it's the standard now. Everybody gets money from the pharmaceutical industry. So if I do it, I'm not an outlier anymore.
So let's end on something that made me laugh out aloud when I opened White Coat Black Hats, which is the case of the fake psychiatry resident I think you wrote about. I just wanted to end with this stunning, hilarious, terrifying case.
My younger brother, Hal, trained in psychiatry, and this was when he just first began. He had a colleague in his first year residency class who I gave a different name in the book. I'm not sure I should out him, although anyone affiliated with the University of North Carolina psychiatry program will know his name. But he came into the program with these sort of amazing credentials, MD, PhD from Harvard, PhD in neuroscience. He managed to complete, I think, 14 months as a resident before it was discovered that he actually had no credentials at all. I mean, he had no MD, no PhD, hadn't been to Harvard. It was all a complete fake. He basically faked his way through this residency. I got very interested in this story later on and went back thinking that I was going to write about it. Maybe I will. But went back and interviewed a number of his fellow residents and faculty members who remember that experience in the early 1990s. And there were several things that, threads that ran through their stories. One is just the crazy lies and exaggerations that that came out of his mouth. So, like in one case, he told one that he used to work as a filmmaker with Steven Spielberg. He told somebody else that he used to be a place kicker for the Texas Longhorns football team when he was in college. He told stories about, visiting the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport and sailing with the Kennedys. I mean, constantly, these things that made no sense whatsoever. And the one thing that, that I can remember Hal, my brother, telling me is that he said, I never liked the guy. I didn't suspect that he was a complete fake. But I never liked him. And part of the reason was I found his attitude toward me strange, which he said, he was a suck up. He sucked up to everybody. But what I didn't get was why he was sucking up to me, right? I had nothing to give him, it was like he didn't understand that it's sucking up, right? You don't suck sideways. But the other thing that I thought was really interesting is he remembered a didactic session that was on neurochemistry and neurotransmitters. And he said, the lecturer was kind of saying, well, where should we start? Somebody name a neurotransmitter. Lee, what's your favorite neurotransmitter? And he said that he just froze and he couldn't name a single neurotransmitter. I mean, at a time when like everybody in America knew what serotonin was. But Hal said, the interesting thing to me is that it didn't occur to me that he was like a fake psychiatrist as a result of that, or that, he said, what occurred to me was, man, I thought Harvard was supposed to be good. This guy has an MD, PhD, and he doesn't really know anything. He said, I knew he was a very bad doctor, like he was a very bad intern. It never occurred to me that he was not a doctor at all.
It just makes me think how the labels we have matter, right? I mean, if the same things that he said had been said by someone with even a very mild psychiatric diagnosis, we would have looked at it and said delusions of grandeur right there. I remember the case of Camilla Brock, who, after she received a diagnosis, after she was picked up by traffic cops, She said, guys, I'm a regular investment banker, like Obama follows me on Twitter. And in her report, it said, has delusions of grandeur when Obama did follow her on Twitter. And here is a guy, because, he has these supposed credentials, anything out of his mouth receives a certain type of validity and validation. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us. You can listen to our other podcasts on Mad in America. Have a good evening.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.